Halloween marks the 3rd anniversary of the Backyard History podcast. Thanks so much for listening. This podcast launched back on Halloween of 2021, kicking off with a strange story of a sea monster in Lake Utopia. Since then, we've kind of stuck with this spooky theme for our Halloween/anniversary episodes. The following year, we covered a ghost story with a remarkable twist called The Spectre of Rexton, which might be my favorite episode. The year after that, we did the famous story of a cursed, eternally burning ghost ship with the fire ship of the Baie de Chaleur. And now we pretty much have to stick with this ghost theme. So today, to celebrate our 3rd anniversary, we are going to Prince Edward Island to follow along with one remarkably unexpected main character. A young woman who wrote something incredibly rare back in the mid-1800s. A first-person account of her own personal investigation into a ghost living in her house. She and her husband had just moved from England to Charlottetown, where they bought up this massive mansion, actually the largest house on the whole island, only to encounter the ghost of Binstead Manor.
You're listening to Backyard History, the hidden stories that happened in your own backyard, the podcast version of the weekly history column running in newspapers across the Maritimes, with your host and author, Andrew McLean.
It was the year 1856 that my husband took me to live at a house called Binstead, about 5 miles from Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island.
Our ghost investigator would only write down her story years later, after she had returned home to England. It would instantly cause a sensation. Newspapers who reprinted her story simply credited her as Mrs. Arthur Penney, which is how she's been remembered ever since. This is part of a peculiar Victorian habit of women taking not only their husband's last names, but even their first names. Her actual name was Georgina. Before she was married, she was named Georgina Mary Ward. She enjoyed a very wealthy and luxurious upbringing in London as the youngest daughter of an extremely famous record-breaking cricket player turned British Member of Parliament. As for Mr. Arthur Penney, her husband, he offers us another rarity for the Victorian era. A husband about whom less is known than his wife. As far as I can tell, he seems to have been one of those wealthy, aristocratic elites who somehow managed to get through life without any obvious source of income or a need for a job. It was his idea to move to PEI in the first place, although nobody really explains why. It certainly wasn't to get a job. But go to PEI, Georgina and Arthur did. And there they found a great deal on this massive house called Binstead Manor that was selling for an unusually low price. In fact, some might call it a suspiciously low price. Georgina and her husband didn't outright buy Binstead Manor, but rather they leased to own it from a man named Robert Fellows, who seemed to be awfully eager to rid himself of Binstead Manor.
It was a good-sized house, and at the back had been considerably extended to allow of extra offices, since there were about 200 acres of farmland around it, necessitating several resident farming men.
This was a time of distinct social classes which did not interact with one another. As an elite lady from Victorian England, Georgina had almost certainly been raised in a world where servants had separate entrances and weren't supposed to be seen or heard. However, due to the unusual layout of Binstead Manor, Georgina had to share her house with not only her own servants, but also with men employed on this vast working farm that had come with Binstead Manor. She explained the house's layout.
Although forming part of the house, these premises could only be entered through the inner kitchen, as no wall had ever been broken down to form a door or passage from upstairs. Thus, the farming men's sleeping rooms were adjacent to those occupied by the family and visitors, although there was no communication through the upstairs corridor.
The farm workers had been there before the Pennays were. They had been hired by Robert Fellows, the house's previous owner, and they continued to work for the Pennays as if nothing had changed, even after the house changed owners. However, the first sign Georgina noticed which suggested something might be amiss with Binstead Manor was when she noted that one particularly young farm worker, who was named Harry, would always lock his door at night.
He was most careful to fasten his door before retiring. I never could get Harry to tell me much. At the time, I attached no importance to his ways.
It didn't take long before these unusual, strange noises began to be heard in the night inside their new mansion.
About 10 days after we had established ourselves at Binstead, we commenced hearing strange noises.
As time passed, these sounds grew even louder.
The noise was more like a rumbling, which made the house vibrate.
Georgina wrote that it sounded like
the sound produced by dragging a heavy body.
As the days turned to weeks in her new house, these sounds grew worse.
For many weeks, they were a very frequent occurrence and were heard simultaneously in every part of the house and always appeared to be in close proximity to each person.
As the autumn turned to winter, Georgina remained curiously unperturbed by any of this as the noises in the night continued. If you thought this would be the story of a stuffy Victorian lady screaming and fainting about a ghost in her house, you thought wrong, because Georgina is definitely not troubled by this ghost. Best she would be mildly interested, which is quite something because it sounds like these noises in the house were pretty disruptive. Georgina didn't think that a rumbling house or what sounded like a body being dragged around throughout the night was a big enough deal that it would prevent her from inviting her friends over to stay the night. Those friends who spent the night were the first people Georgina ever heard of to actually see the ghost of Binstead Manor.
It was in February, I think, 1857, that the first apparition came under my notice. Two ladies were sleeping in the bedroom. About 2 o'clock, Mrs. M was awakened by a bright light which pervaded the room. She saw a woman standing by the fireplace. Of course, for that season of the year, a fire had been lighted. In her left arm was a young baby, and with her right hand she was stirring the ashes over which she was slightly stooping. Mrs. M pushed Mrs. Carey to awaken her. Mrs. Carey had previously heard some tales concerning the house being haunted, which neither Mrs. M nor I had ever heard. Just then, a figure turned her face towards them, disclosing the features of quite a young woman with a singularly anxious, pleading look upon her face. Mrs. M took notice of a little check shawl, which was cloaked over her bosom. Mrs. Carey screamed and pulled the bedclothes tightly over the heads of herself and her companion, so that the sequel of the ghost's proceedings is unknown.
Mrs. M, who of the two women had been more inclined to keep her wits about her, said
she noticed a frilled cap on the woman.
This frilled cap was a particular Irish fashion of the time, leading Georgina to wonder if the mysterious ghost had come from Ireland. Aside from some vague questions about the fashion sense of the ghost, Georgina remained mostly unbothered, and she seems to have had relatively few opinions on a ghost living in her house. In time, though, soon the haunting grew much worse.
As spring came on, we began to hear shrieks which would grow fainter or louder as if someone was being chased around the house, but always culminating in a regular volley of shrieks, sobs, moans, and half-uttered words, proceeding from beneath a tree that stood at a little distance from the dining room window, and whose branches nearly touched the window of the bedroom I have mentioned.
Georgina noticed that all of this racket seemed to be based around that same guest room where her friends had spent the night.
It was always in or near the sleeping apartment, immediately adjacent to the men's, that the apparition was seen.
I'm sure you've noticed that our main character is remarkably unconcerned by the ghostly noises that sound like a body being dragged around in her new house, and the screaming sounds and even by two of her friends seeing the ghost of a woman carrying a baby, which is pretty surprising because this is Victorian times and you might think people are dramatic today, but these Victorians, we don't have anything on them. And this interesting detail of how calm she is actually why her story ended up being so popular. It seems that even the Victorians were getting sick of the Victorians. Most of the ghost stories of the time, which were very popular, actually, they involved a main character being really theatrical and a whole bunch of screaming and fainting and wailing and crying. Georgina was not super bothered by this whole thing, and she told her story without much flourish, and this made her a lot more credible to people when her story became public. She was so unbothered by this ghost in her house that even though she thought it was coming from the guest room, she didn't actually avoid that room. In fact, one night she decided to sleep in the guest room. And that was the night when she came face to face with the ghost herself. That night, her baby was sick, so she moved both herself and her young daughter to the spare bedroom to spend the night.
My little daughter was far from well, so I had her bed wheeled in beside mine, in the room that I might attend to her. About 12 o'clock, I got up to give her some medicine, and was feeling for the matches when she called my attention to a brilliant light shining under the door. I exclaimed that it was her papa, and threw open the door to admit him. I found myself face to face with a woman. She had a baby on her left arm, a check shawl crossed over her bosom, and all around her shone a bright, pleasant light, whence emanating I could not say. She did not enter the room, but moved across the staircase, vanishing into the opposite wall, exactly where the inner manservant's room was situated.
Georgina, again, was distinctly less than bothered by this. In fact, she didn't find the ghost to be the least bit frightening.
Neither my daughter nor myself felt the slightest alarm, nor did my dogs bark.
When she told her husband that story, he, on the other hand, was definitely bothered by a ghost in their house. He thoroughly searched the wall, he searched the corridor, he searched the staircase. He was looking for any way that a woman who was not a ghost, a real woman, would have been able to get into and exit the building. But he found nothing. Georgina found herself thinking back with fascination on this gaze the woman had given her.
Her look at me was one of entreaty, almost agonizing entreaty.
Georgina decided that she would investigate the ghost story and figure out who this ghostly woman living in Binstead Manor was and what had happened to her. Georgina wasn't a ghost hunter in terms of trying to capture a ghost. She doesn't actually seem super interested in the ghost. She was more of a ghost story hunter. She wanted to know who the ghost had been while she was still alive and what her story was and how she ended up being a ghost. Georgina began to spend more time in Charlottetown. She was investigating the history of Binstead Manor. She learned that
the ground on which Binstead stood had been cleared.
This would have been done on the orders of Baron James Montgomery, who, as part of PEI's early history as a haven for large British absentee landlords, was given a 1,000-year-long lease to the property in 1807. It was he who paid to clear the land, and he established it as farmlands, and like many of these other absentee landlords, charged a fortune in rent to local farmers to use this land.
Later, by about 1840, a rich Englishman had built a very nice house.
At this point, the land had been sold to John Levitt Esquire, a politician who was a member of the province's powerful executive council. It was Levitt who constructed Binstead Manor in 1833. According to Charlottetown's Heritage Office, Binstead was constructed in the tradition of a country estate to have a water view and would have been a noteworthy feature in the landscape, when there would have been few houses of its size and style in rural Prince Edward Island. According to Georgina's asking around in Charlottetown, though,
getting tired of colonial life, John Levitt Esquire sold the property to a man whose name I forgot, but whom I will call Pigott. That was like the name. He was a man of low tastes and immoral habits.
considering that Georgina had no problem remembering everyone else's names and she got all of these historical details correct, she probably didn't actually forget this person's name, but she chose to omit it. The man she called Piggott was almost certainly Charles Braddock, a wealthy shipbuilder who acquired Binstead Manor through a highly unusual land swap in which he traded his family's farm, which had been in his family for 4 generations, for Binstead House and its farm. He would only own it for 7 years before selling it to Robert Fellows. That was the guy who Georgina leased to own Binstead Manor from. Relatively little is known about Charles Braddock, and the few facts that we do know about him really bring up way more questions than they offer in terms of answers about him. He seems to have started off as a farmer. We find him pop up in newspaper reports, competing in plow races as a young man. When he got older, though, he made a sudden and improbable rise in wealth to acquire huge amounts of money, which was a really extremely unusual thing to do because PEI's society was really stratified at the time. Charles Braddock would somehow come to own fleets of fishing ships. He would own vast tracts of farmland. He owned mills, homes, and he owned Binstead Manor. According to Georgina, while he lived at Binstead,
he had 2 sisters in his service, the daughters of a laborer named Thomas Newberry, who lived in a regular hovel, about 3 miles nearer town. At a time, each of the Newberry sisters gave birth to a boy.
As Georgina asked around the local people for more details, she learned.
Very little can be learned of the domestic arrangements since Piggott bore so bad a name that the house was avoided by respectable people.
After Georgina's story was published and caused a really big stir in England, it made its way back to PEI, where the Charlottetown Daily Examiner newspaper published it right on its front page with the headline saying, "A real ghost," with an exclamation point. In that story, even though Georgina used a fake name of Piggott for Charles Braddock, the Islanders instantly knew who she was talking about. Although he had recently died just before the story was published, a couple of other Islanders did actually publicly defend him. For example, Donald Ferguson wrote to the paper to declare,
"The insinuations of immorality and crime made by Mrs. Penny regarding his domestic life at Binstead are wholly without foundation."
However, even while trying to defend Charles Braddock, Ferguson acknowledged in that same letter that Charles Braddock had been
not without his faults.
Meanwhile, another Islander named William Bannerman Robertson elaborated on those faults, saying that Braddock had been
much addicted to the use of intoxicants.
Georgina was unable to decipher exactly what happened, but she decided that the woman and the baby who were ghosts in Binstead Manor were one of those 2 sisters that worked for Charles Braddock. She wrote that while Charles Braddock owned Binstead Manor,
it is certain that 1 sister and 1 baby disappeared altogether, though when and how is a complete mystery.
A short newspaper report from some years earlier hints at some possible credibility to that story that she found. The Islander newspaper reported,
"George Wellick Braddock, youngest son of Charles Braddock, aged 1 year 4 months."
This death was not considered suspicious though, and there was no inquest. Later in that same year, Charles Braddock had a second son. Only a few months later, so not long enough to actually go through a full pregnancy, if you know what I mean. He named the second son Horatio in honor of his dead brother. That same year that he had 2 kids within a shorter than 9-month span, he actually sold Binstead Manor very shortly after. He seems to have had a severe business downturn. I assume it was because he was in shipbuilding. This is around the time wooden ships are being replaced by metal. I don't know for sure, but basically he had business problems and they were getting worse and worse. The year before Georgina arrived in Binstead, Newspaper reports show that sheriffs seized and auctioned off vast amounts of the land owned by Charles Braddock. He died soon after, and his obituary included the extremely unusual and very mysterious line.
He trusted in the merits of his Redeemer, and in his last conflict had victory.
That was the end of Charles Braddock's story, so Georgina turned her attention to trying to figure out what happened to the surviving Newbury sister.
The other sister returned to her father's house and, leaving the baby with Mrs. Newbury, her mother, went to the States and had never returned. Before leaving, she would reveal nothing except that the boy was her sister's, her own being dead.
Seemingly reaching a dead end at figuring out who the sister was and what happened to her, she turned her attention to the missing baby, who would now be a young man in his late teens or so. It was now 1859, and Georgina and her husband began to make plans to move home to England. She didn't really explain why in her writings, but then again, she didn't really explain why she was in PEI to begin with, which honestly, out of the two questions, is probably the odder ones considering she's a wealthy Victorian lady. Also, as a wealthy Victorian lady, Georgina doesn't seem to have bothered at all with the servants and the farm workers the whole time that she lived with them in Binstead Manor. It's only as she's packing up to leave that she spoke to the farm worker named Harry. And she asked him about whether or not he ever saw the ghost.
Harry told me he had several visits but would tell no particulars. I could never get Harry to tell me much.
It was only at this point that she realized for the very first time that despite living in the same house as Harry for the past several years, she didn't even know his last name. So she asked him his last name, and she was shocked by his reply. Newbury. She had questions, but the normally quiet Harry again clammed up. Georgina scrambled back to go find Mrs. Newbury. This would have been the two mysteriously disappeared servant sisters' mother and the grandmother of the mysterious baby. She had actually raised the mysterious baby that Charles Braddock had fathered. This time, when she was faced with the direct question of who Harry was, this mysterious lost baby's grandmother confessed that
it was this very Harry Newbury that we had unwittingly engaged as a farm servant.
Georgina and her husband moved out of Binstead Manor into Charlottetown as they made their final preparations to go home to England. This meant that they were breaking their lease-to-own agreement with Robert Fellows, Binstead Manor's previous owner. Robert Fellows seems to have not been very impressed with this development because he was eager to get rid of the ghost and its house. A solution was arrived at. A priest would come and it would bless Binstead Manor. Harry Newbury came to visit Georgina one last time, just before she left.
He came to bid me farewell a few months after I left Binstead, saying he would never return there.
He revealed to her that the ghost, who was his mother,
had several times stood at the foot of his bed, but he would not tell me more.
It would be nearly 30 years after Georgina finished her investigation and left Binstead Manor that the story of what she discovered would actually become known and caused a sensation. The story of how Georgina's little handwritten story became really famous is an unusual one in and of itself. By this point in her life, she had moved back to England. She was hosting an elite dinner party at Weston Manor, which was one of her many homes. This is located in Freshwater on the Isle of Wight. She told her dinner guests the story of this ghost at Binstead Manor, which would have been about 30 years earlier by this point. Among those dinner guests was a strange man who Queen Victoria herself once described in her diary as
very peculiar looking, tall, dark, with a fine head, long black flowing hair, and a beard, oddly dressed.
He was the great poet, Alfred Lord Tennyson, who's probably best known today for his poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. He was so enthralled by Georgina's story, he asked her to write it down. And like many elite Victorians of the time, Alfred Lord Tennyson was fixated on the idea that ghosts could be proven to be real through science. He was a member of the Society for Psychical Research, which counted amongst its members Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, author of Sherlock Holmes. This extraordinarily well-funded society basically hunted for ghosts. Alfred Lord Tennyson brought Georgina's story to the society, where it sparked a great deal of interest. The society noted that Georgina's story was
striking enough to plead for serious attention to the subject of the appearances of dead persons.
The story soon spilled over into the mainstream general public. It really took England by storm. As for Georgina, though, she wasn't very satisfied with its conclusion. Even before her story became famous, she had tried once more to resolve the story. This was the year 1877, when Georgina returned to Charlottetown and visited her old home of Binstead Manor a second time. In a really remarkably ironic plot twist, in many ways this is a bit of a more shocking plot twist even than Harry being the ghost's son. She was surprised to find that her old house was now owned by her old friend, Mrs. Carey. Do you remember earlier, the first person that had seen the ghost and who was really, really scared of the ghost? Yeah, she now owned the house. This is actually quite surprising because there were quite a few people who saw the ghost, and Mrs. Carey seems to have been the only one in this whole story who was actually scared of it. Most people were actually really not bothered by this ghost. Mrs. Carey must have really liked Binstead Manor, because even all these years later, Georgina soon discovered that Mrs. Carey was still terrified of the ghost. When Georgina told Mrs. Carey that she wanted to stay overnight in the same guest room in the hope of seeing the ghost, is basically Georgina's whole plan. She told Mrs. Carey that, and she was not very impressed. Georgina wrote that
"The room where we all saw the ghost is totally uninhabited, and Mrs. C would not let us stay in it, and entreated us to talk no further on the subject."
So, not getting anywhere from the new owner of Binstead Manor, Georgina tried to clandestinely ask Mrs. Carey's butler for information about the ghost. Georgina found that even difficult, though, because
she followed us up very closely.
When she did finally manage to get a moment alone with the butler, she learned why. The priest's blessing of Binstead Manor apparently did not get rid of the ghost, but only seems to have freed her from the guest room and allowed her to wander around the mansion and the farm as she pleased.
He said that since the priest blessed the house, a woman has been seen, or said to have been seen, he corrected himself, round the front entrance, and once at an upper window.
As for Harry Newbury, he also somehow seems to have been freed. Much like his aunt before him, he also left Prince Edward Island and was never seen again.
That was Backyard History with your host, Andrew McLean. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for another hidden story that happened in your own backyard. Produced by Jordan Lozier.